Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. London in the 1960s was alive with music, fashion, and change. But beneath the bright lights and the swinging culture, a darker story was unfolding. At the heart of it stood two brothers, identical twins who carried both charm and terror wherever they went. Their names were whispered in pubs, feared in alleys, and written about in the papers. They dressed sharp, moved with confidence, and built an empire on fear, loyalty, and violence. The Kray Twins, Ronnie and Reggie, became more than just gangsters. They were celebrities in their own right, photographed with movie stars, politicians, and singers, while running the streets with ruthless power. To many, they looked like the kings of London's East End, untouchable and unstoppable. But behind the polished suits and the charm was a world of extortion, brutal attacks, and murder. This is the story of the Kray Twins, how two brothers rose from humble beginnings to become London's most feared figures, and how their empire of crime eventually came crashing down. The story of Ronnie and Reggie Kray began in the tough streets of London's East End. They were born in 1933 in Hoxton, a poor but lively neighborhood where life was hard and respect had to be earned. Their family lived in a small house, and their father, Charlie Kray Sr., worked as a wardrobe dealer. He was often away from home, leaving their mother Violet to raise the children. Violet loved her sons deeply and protected them fiercely. To her, Ronnie and Reggie were not gangsters in the making. They were her boys, and she believed they were destined for something great. Growing up, the twins were inseparable. They looked almost the same, but their personalities were different. Reggie was the calmer one, charming and able to talk his way through problems. Ronnie was fiery, unpredictable, and had a temper that could explode at any moment. Together, they were a dangerous combination, balancing brains and brutality. The East End at that time was full of poverty and crime. Many families struggled to put food on the table, and young men often turned to street fighting and petty theft to survive. For Ronnie and Reggie, fighting became second nature. They were known in their neighborhood for their strength and their refusal to back down from anyone. As teenagers, they were already feared by boys older than them. The twins first found discipline in boxing. Encouraged by their grandfather, they began training at local clubs. Boxing gave them an outlet for their energy and aggression, and they quickly proved themselves in the ring. Reggie was skilled and fast, while Ronnie relied on sheer power and intimidation. They dreamed of becoming professional boxers, perhaps even champions. For a while, it seemed like the sport might keep them out of trouble, but their violent nature often got in the way. Street fights, run-ins with the law, and reckless behavior pulled them back toward crime. The more they fought, the more respect they gained on the streets, and soon they realized that fear could be as valuable as skill. People began to step aside when the twins walked by, and that feeling of power was something they wanted more of. During their teenage years, London was still recovering from World War II. Bomb sites scarred the city, and many parts of the East End were rough and lawless. Black markets thrived, and gangs controlled the streets. Ronnie and Reggie grew up in this atmosphere, learning quickly that those who were bold and ruthless could take whatever they wanted. By the time they reached their late teens, the Kray twins were already building a reputation as leaders. They gathered friends and local boys who admired their toughness, forming a small gang. At first, they ran protection schemes in their neighborhood, demanding money from shop owners in exchange for safety. It was the beginning of what would later become their criminal empire. The twins were also ambitious. They didn't just want to be street thugs. They wanted to rise higher, to control more, and to be recognized across London. To achieve this, they needed to make connections beyond the East End. They started frequenting pubs, clubs, and places where businessmen and criminals mixed. Reggie, with his charm, often handled conversations, while Ronnie's presence alone was enough to keep people intimidated. Despite their growing reputation, trouble followed them. Both twins were called to serve in the British Army during national service. But the military discipline clashed with their rebellious nature. They refused to obey orders, fought with fellow soldiers, and even attacked officers. Their violent behavior led to imprisonment within the army and eventually dishonorable discharge. Instead of learning discipline, their time with the army only fueled their defiance against authority. When they returned to London, the twins were more determined than ever to carve out a name for themselves. They opened a nightclub, a smart move that gave them both money and influence. At their club, they mixed with celebrities, politicians, and entertainers. This was the start of their double life: respected businessmen on the surface, ruthless gangsters in the shadows. Ronnie, however, was becoming more unstable. He suffered from mental health issues that made his temper even more dangerous. He was prone to violent outbursts, and his unpredictability kept everyone on edge. Reggie often tried to control him, but even he could not always keep his brother in check. The twins' loyalty to each other was absolute, but Ronnie's growing volatility would eventually drag them deeper into darkness. By the end of the 1950s, the Kray Twins had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with in the East End. They were feared by rivals, respected by their followers, and beginning to be noticed outside their neighborhood. Their combination of charm and violence made them unique, and they were only just getting started. The streets of London were changing, and so were the Krays. They had tasted power, and they wanted more. From small-time extortionists, they were evolving into crime bosses who would soon control some of the city's most famous nightclubs. But with power came enemies, and with enemies came violence that would define their legacy. For now, though, the Kray Twins stood at the edge of their rise, still young, but already notorious. London had not yet seen the full extent of their ruthlessness. The city would soon learn that when the Krays wanted something, they would take it, no matter the cost. As the 1960s began, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were no longer just young men from the East End. They were becoming powerful figures whose names carried weight across London. Their next step was to grow beyond small gangs and protection rackets. They wanted to rule, and they had the ambition to make it happen. The key to their rise was their control of nightclubs. In post-war London, nightclubs were more than places for dancing and drinking. They were meeting points where businessmen, politicians, celebrities, and criminals all crossed paths. By owning clubs, the Krays could sit at the center of this social web, gaining influence in both high society and the underworld. One of their most famous clubs was the Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge. It was glamorous, filled with wealthy visitors and entertainers. Movie stars, singers, and even members of Parliament were seen there. To the outside world, the Krays appeared as charming hosts, always in sharp suits, always polite. Reggie especially knew how to make guests feel welcome, shaking hands, smiling, and acting like a true gentleman. But behind the scenes, violence and intimidation ensured that the Krays kept control. The twins also ran the Double R Club in the East End, which became their stronghold. It was here that their reputation for fear was strongest. Local gangs knew better than to cross them, and those who tried often paid the price. Ronnie and Reggie surrounded themselves with loyal men, their gang known as the Firm. The Firm included friends, family, and young toughs who were willing to do whatever the twins demanded. Together, they enforced the Krays' will across London. With their growing power, the Krays began extorting businessmen and demanding a share of profits from clubs, gambling dens, and other enterprises. They offered protection, but everyone knew it was really a threat. Pay the Krays and your business was safe. Refuse, and you risked being beaten, burned out, or worse. Many people chose to pay quietly, knowing that standing against the twins was nearly impossible. Yet, at the same time, the Krays were becoming celebrities. They appeared in newspapers, not only for their criminal reputation, but also for their friendships with famous people. They were photographed with actors, singers, and even lords. For some, the Krays were symbols of the glamorous, dangerous side of London. Their presence at parties and events made them seem untouchable, almost larger than life. Still, their rise was not without problems. Ronnie's mental health was worsening. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but he refused to take regular treatment. He became increasingly unstable, prone to sudden fits of rage and suspicion. He also began openly expressing his sexuality in a time when being gay was not widely accepted. Some people respected his boldness, but others feared that his unpredictable nature would destroy everything the twins were building. Reggie, in contrast, tried to appear calm and in control. He wanted the Krays to be seen as respectable businessmen as much as gangsters. But his loyalty to Ronnie meant that he could never separate himself from his brother's dangerous behavior. No matter how reckless Ronnie became, Reggie would stand by his side. The Krays' reputation for violence grew stronger during this period. They were not just businessmen, they were feared enforcers. Stories spread about how Ronnie could attack someone without warning, or how Reggie would deal with rivals quietly but effectively. Their enemies often disappeared or were left badly beaten. The fear of crossing the Krays kept most people silent, but their growing empire also attracted rivals. Other gangs in London resented the Krays' rise. The Richardson brothers, who operated mainly in South London, were among their fiercest competitors. Known for their own brutal methods, including torture, the Richardsons clashed with the Krays over territory and influence. London was becoming a city divided between two powerful gangs, and violence between them seemed unavoidable. Despite this, the Krays continued to climb. They were invited to high-class events, and even politicians sought their company. They used their money and influence to gain protection from some officials and policemen, which made them even harder to touch. For ordinary people in the East End, the Krays were like kings. Some admired them for standing up for their community, while others lived in constant fear of their cruelty. The twins also invested in property and other businesses, spreading their wealth and power further. They were no longer just gangsters on the street. They were businessmen, celebrities, and underworld rulers all at once. But as their influence grew, so did the violence surrounding them. Ronnie, in particular, began to attract attention for his reckless actions. He would sometimes pull out a gun in public or threaten people without hesitation. He liked to remind everyone that he and his brother were not men to be challenged. His temper and paranoia made him dangerous, not just to enemies, but sometimes to his own allies. Reggie, though more careful, was also ruthless when necessary. He could charm people with a smile, but behind that charm was a cold determination. If someone betrayed him, Reggie would ensure they paid the price. He wanted control, and he would not let anyone stand in his way. By the mid-1960s, the Kray Twins had achieved the fame and power they always wanted. They ruled the East End, ran clubs that attracted the rich and famous, and were known across the country. To some, they were admired figures who represented strength and style. To others, they were brutal criminals who spread fear wherever they went. But with every step higher, the risks grew greater. Their enemies were waiting for chances to strike, and the police were slowly beginning to take more interest in their activities. The Krays believed they were untouchable, but the world around them was changing. For now, though, Ronnie and Reggie stood at the peak of their rise. They had power, wealth, and fame. They were the faces of London's criminal underworld, and they relished the attention. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form, cracks that would soon threaten everything they had built. By the mid-1960s, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were not just feared, they were legends of the London underworld. Their clubs were popular, their empire was growing, and their names were known in every corner of the city. But with fame came pressure, and with pressure came violence. The Krays had built their power on fear, and to keep that power, they needed to remind everyone that betrayal or disrespect would not be tolerated. The first major turning point came with the murder of George Cornell. George was a member of the Richardson gang, bitter rivals of the Krays. The Richardsons ruled much of South London and were known for their brutal methods. They tortured rivals with electric shocks, pliers, and acid. Their cruelty matched the Krays' own reputation, and the two sides hated each other. On the night of March 9, 1966, Ronnie walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, one of the most famous pubs in East London. Inside sat George Cornell drinking calmly at the bar. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone knew the history between the two men. Ronnie, already unstable and carrying his paranoia like a shadow, did not hesitate. He pulled out a gun, walked straight toward Cornell, and shot him in the head in front of everyone. The killing was cold and public. People in the pub were frozen with shock, too afraid to move or speak. Ronnie left as if nothing had happened, confident that no one would dare testify against him. And he was right. Even though the pub had many witnesses, the fear of the Krays kept mouths shut. Cornell's murder sent a clear message across London. The Krays were not afraid of anyone, not even the Richardsons. While Ronnie's actions shocked many, Reggie was not innocent either. His darker side showed itself in the case of Jack the Hat McVitie, a small-time criminal who had once worked with the Krays. McVitie had been given money by the twins for a job, but he failed to deliver. Worse, he began speaking against the Krays, mocking them and refusing to pay back what he owed. For the Krays, this was unforgivable. Betrayal could not go unpunished. In October 1967, Reggie was persuaded by Ronnie and others in the firm to deal with McVitie once and for all. At a party in Hackney, McVitie was lured inside, thinking it was just another night of drinking. But once there, the mood shifted. He was attacked, held down, and beaten. Reggie then took a knife and stabbed him repeatedly, killing him in front of everyone. The murder of Jack McVitie showed just how far Reggie had fallen. The charming, controlled twin who once dreamed of being seen as respectable was now committing brutal killings with his own hands. The Krays empire was built on such violence, but these acts also marked the beginning of their downfall. The killings of George Cornell and Jack McVitie were not just gang punishments. They were bold, reckless crimes that drew attention from both rivals and the police. Scotland Yard had long suspected the Krays of controlling London's underworld, but evidence was always hard to find. Witnesses were too afraid to come forward, and the twins' connections to powerful people gave them protection. But now, with public murders happening in crowded places, the police had more reason than ever to go after them. At the same time, Ronnie's mental health was spinning further out of control. His paranoia made him believe enemies were everywhere. He carried guns constantly and sometimes threatened people without cause. Even his closest associates were nervous around him, unsure of what he might do next. Reggie tried to control his brother, but their bond made it impossible for him to pull away. Whatever Ronnie did, Reggie would defend him. Despite the growing danger, the Krays still enjoyed their double life. On one side, they were photographed with stars like Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland, living in luxury, attending high-class events, and running glamorous clubs. On the other, they were ruthless killers ruling the East End with fear. This strange mix of fame and violence made them unlike any criminals Britain had ever seen. But the cracks in their empire were widening. Members of the firm were becoming uneasy. Some feared the twins' recklessness would bring the police crashing down on all of them. Others worried about their own safety, knowing how quickly Ronnie or Reggie could turn against friends. Behind the public image of power, the Krays organization was beginning to fracture. The public murders also shook London itself. People who once admired the twins as stylish, fearless men began to see them for what they really were: violent gangsters whose charm could not hide their cruelty. The myth of the Krays as glamorous celebrities was fading, replaced by fear and disgust. The police, too, were changing their tactics. Scotland Yard began to gather evidence quietly, building cases step by step. They worked to break the wall of silence that had always protected the twins. Detectives spoke to witnesses, pressured associates, and looked for anyone willing to risk standing against the Krays. Slowly, their net began to tighten. Yet, even as the danger closed in, the twins remained confident. They believed their reputation made them untouchable. They believed their connections in politics and business would protect them. And above all, they believed that their bond as brothers made them invincible. But the murders of Cornell and McVitie had set events in motion that could not be stopped. London had tolerated the Krays' reign for years, half in fear and half in fascination. But with blood spilled so openly, the tide was turning. The Krays had crossed a line, and their world would never be the same again. The murders of George Cornell and Jack the Hat McVitie changed everything for the Kray twins. Until then, many of their crimes had been hidden behind silence and fear. But killing men in front of witnesses was different. Scotland Yard could no longer ignore them. The police had suspected the Krays for years, but now they had the excuse they needed to strike harder. Detective Leonard "Nipper" Reed became one of the leading figures in the fight against the Krays. He was determined, patient, and clever. Reed understood that breaking the twins' empire would not be easy. The main problem was silence. People were too scared to testify, too afraid of what might happen if they spoke against the Krays. Even victims often stayed quiet, preferring to pay money or accept threats rather than risk their lives. But Reed was not ready to give up. He and his team began building a case piece by piece. They studied the Krays' movements, followed members of the firm, and looked for weaknesses. They also started speaking to those who had once been close to the twins. Some of these men had grown tired of the fear and violence. Others felt betrayed by Ronnie and Reggie and were secretly willing to talk. Slowly, the wall of silence began to crack. Meanwhile, the Krays continued to live as if they were untouchable. They walked the streets in fine suits, visited their clubs, and attended parties with famous stars. They loved the attention and believed their reputation still protected them. Reggie, always calmer, liked to show off his business side, while Ronnie, more unstable, grew more reckless each day. His paranoia and sudden bursts of anger made him a danger not only to rivals, but even to his own men. The people of London were also changing their view of the twins. For years, many in the East End had admired them. Some believed they looked after their community, handing out money, protecting locals, and presenting themselves as gentlemen. But the brutal murders, the threats, and the fear began to overshadow any good they had done. The Krays were no longer seen as local heroes. They were seen as dangerous criminals who had gone too far. Rival gangs sensed weakness. The Richardsons, once the Krays' fiercest enemies, were already facing their own problems with the law. Other smaller gangs began to test the Krays' strength, hoping the police pressure would weaken their control. The underworld, once united in silence, started to shift. Not everyone was loyal to the Krays anymore. Detective Reed used this to his advantage. He encouraged those with grudges to speak out. Slowly, he gathered witnesses who could connect the twins to crimes. It was not easy. Every witness knew that if their name leaked, their life could be in danger. But Red promised protection and pushed forward. By 1968, the pressure on the Krays was heavy. The newspapers that once praised their style now began to write about their crimes. Rumors spread about what they had done, and the murders of Cornell and McVitie were whispered about everywhere. People were beginning to see them less as glamorous celebrities and more as cold-blooded killers. The twins, however, still believed they were above the law. They laughed at the police, convinced that no jury would ever convict them. They thought their reputation was enough to silence anyone who might testify. For years, this had been true. But now the police were closer than ever, and the twins did not see how fast their empire was crumbling. Inside the firm, fear was growing. Some men who once followed the twins without question began to wonder how long it would last. Ronnie's violent behavior made many nervous. Reggie's charm was no longer enough to keep everyone calm. Cracks began to appear in their once solid gang. Some members wanted out, while others secretly thought about helping the police. Detective Reed decided it was time to move. Scotland Yard planned a major raid, one that would show the Krays they were no longer untouchable. In May 1968, at dawn, police officers stormed the Krays' homes and businesses. Ronnie and Reggie were both arrested, along with many members of the firm. The raids were carefully planned to prevent escape and to shock the underworld into realizing the Krays' power was slipping. The arrests were a turning point. For the first time, the Krays were truly in police custody, facing charges that could not easily be brushed aside. The murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie, along with numerous other crimes, were now at the center of Scotland Yard's case. Detective Red believed he finally had the evidence and witnesses needed to bring them down. For Ronnie and Reggie, the world had changed. Their glamorous image was cracking, their empire was shaking, and their freedom was slipping away. The men who once walked into nightclubs with movie stars now sat in prison cells, waiting for trials that would decide their future. But even then, the Krays did not show fear. They still believed they could win, that their names and reputation would protect them. They underestimated how much London had turned against them and how determined the police were to finally end their reign. The city that had once admired their style now wanted justice, and justice was coming. The arrest of Ronnie and Reggie Kray in 1968 shocked London. For years, the twins had walked the streets as if they were untouchable. They wore fine suits, stood beside famous stars and ruled the East End with fear. But now Scotland Yard had them behind bars, facing charges that could not be ignored. Their empire was beginning to collapse, and the world was watching closely. Detective Leonard Nipper Red had worked for years to bring the Krays down. He knew that arrests were only the first step. The real challenge was the trial. To convict the twins, he needed witnesses who were brave enough to speak. This was not easy. Everyone feared the Krays. Even when locked in prison, the twins still had loyal men on the outside. Anyone who testified risked being attacked or even killed. Still, the police managed to find people willing to talk. Some members of the firm were tired of living under fear. Others felt betrayed by Ronnie and Reggie and saw the trial as a chance to escape their control. Slowly, names were added to the list of witnesses. Each one gave detectives more evidence, enough to connect the Krays to violence, extortion, and murder. The trial began in 1969, and it became one of the most famous in British history. Crowds gathered outside the Old Bailey Court in London, eager to catch a glimpse of the twins. Reporters filled the newspapers with details, turning the case into a public spectacle. The Krays, who once loved the attention of the press, now faced headlines that painted them as dangerous killers. Inside the courtroom, Ronnie and Reggie behaved as if they were still in control. They sat in their sharp suits, calm and confident. They whispered to each other, smirked at the witnesses, and tried to show they were not afraid. Ronnie sometimes lost his temper, shouting or glaring, while Reggie stayed quieter, his charm fading behind the weight of the accusations. The witnesses told their stories carefully, but firmly. Some described how the Krays had threatened them, demanded money, or beaten them. Others spoke about the murders. The most powerful testimonies came from those who had been present when Jack the Hat McVitie was killed. They described how Reggie had stabbed him again and again, leaving no doubt that the twins were guilty. For once, the wall of silence that had protected the Krays was broken. People were finally speaking out, and the jury was listening. Detective Reed's years of work were paying off. Piece by piece, the image of the Krays as untouchable kings of London was falling apart. The defense tried to argue that the witnesses were lying, that they were only speaking against the twins to save themselves. But the evidence was too strong. The murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie could no longer be hidden. The intimidation, the threats, and the extortion were clear. The jury saw through the defense, and the case against the Krays grew stronger every day. Outside the courtroom, the public watched with fascination. Some still admired the twins, remembering the days when they handed out money in the East End and acted like local heroes. But most now saw the truth. The Krays were not glamorous celebrities. They were brutal gangsters who had terrorized London for too long. The trial dragged on for months, but the outcome became clearer as time passed. Ronnie's outbursts in court did not help their case. His temper and unstable behavior made him look dangerous and unpredictable. Reggie's calm act was not enough to hide his guilt. For the first time, the twins looked like ordinary men facing justice, not kings of the underworld. In March 1969, the verdict was announced. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were both found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison, with a recommendation that they serve at least 30 years. It was one of the harshest sentences ever given in Britain at the time, and it marked the end of the Krays' reign. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Some of the twins' supporters wept, while others sat in silence. The press rushed to report the news, declaring that London's most notorious gangsters had finally been brought down. For Detective Reed and his team, it was a victory years in the making. For the Krays, it was the end of the life they had built. After the sentencing, the twins were taken away. No longer free men, but prisoners. Their empire crumbled without them. The firm fell apart, their clubs lost influence, and their connections in high society vanished. The glamour that had once surrounded them disappeared, leaving only the reality of their crimes. The trial of the Kray twins became a warning for others in the underworld. It showed that no matter how feared or powerful someone seemed, justice could still catch up with them. For the people of London, it was the end of an era, the fall of two brothers who had ruled with charm and cruelty, and who now faced the rest of their lives behind bars. But the story of the Krays did not end in the courtroom. Even in prison, they remained famous. Their names continued to appear in newspapers, their legend growing as people told stories about their past. Some still admired them, while others only remembered the fear. For Ronnie and Reggie, life would never be the same again. When Ronnie and Reggie Kray were sent to prison in 1969, it marked the end of their rule over London's underworld. But prison did not erase their names. Even behind bars, the twins remained famous and their story continued to grow. For many, the legend of the Krays only became stronger as they lived out the rest of their lives in captivity. Ronnie was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital, because of his mental illness. His violent outbursts and paranoia made him too unstable for a normal prison. At Broadmoor, he was treated as both a patient and a prisoner. The hospital tried to manage his schizophrenia with medication, but Ronnie often resisted treatment. Even locked away, he enjoyed attention from visitors and journalists who wanted to hear his stories. Reggie, on the other hand, was placed in a regular prison. Life behind bars was very different from the glamorous nights in clubs and parties with celebrities. The sharp suits were gone, replaced by prison uniforms. The freedom to intimidate or charm people disappeared. Reggie, who once walked the streets like a king, now lived under strict rules. But even in prison, the twins remained powerful in reputation. Other inmates respected and sometimes feared them. Letters poured in from supporters, some from people who admired their tough image, others from women who were fascinated by their story. Over time, the Krays became strange icons, remembered not only as gangsters, but also as symbols of a wild and violent era in London. Ronnie continued to struggle with his mental health. His paranoia often made him believe enemies were out to get him, even in the hospital, but he also kept his pride. He gave interviews, wrote letters, and spoke openly about his life. In some ways, he enjoyed the fame. Being remembered was important to him, even if it meant being remembered as a criminal. Reggie's life in prison was quieter, though he never forgot his loyalty to his brother. Over the years, he reflected on the choices they had made. Some believed that Reggie regretted the murder of Jack the Hat McVitie most of all, because it was the act that sealed their downfall. At times, he tried to show he was more than just a gangster, writing about his life and speaking about his faith. Yet, no matter what he said, the world always remembered him first as one of the Kray Twins. The years passed slowly. The twins had been young men when they were jailed, full of energy and power. Now, time began to take its toll. Ronnie grew older, his health weakening inside Broadmoor. Reggie also aged, his sharp charm fading. The empire they had built on the streets of London was long gone. The clubs were closed or owned by others, their loyal gang had broken apart, and new criminals had taken their place in the underworld. Still, the Krays remained part of British culture. Books were written about them, films were made, and journalists never stopped retelling their story. Some people glamorized them, calling them gentlemen gangsters who once ruled with style. Others reminded the public of their cruelty, their violence, and the lives they had destroyed. The truth was somewhere in between. Two brothers who rose from nothing, built power through fear, and lost everything to their own brutality. In 1995, Ronnie Kray died of a heart attack at the age of 61. He had spent more than 2 decades in Broadmoor, living as both a patient and a prisoner. His death marked the end of one half of the infamous duo. Many people attended his funeral, from old friends to curious onlookers. Even in death, Ronnie drew attention, his name still powerful enough to fill the news. Reggie carried on alone, but without his brother, his life in prison became even harder. He remained behind bars, reflecting on the past, speaking occasionally to the press, and receiving visitors who wanted to hear the story of the Krays from his own lips. Over the years, he showed signs of being a more thoughtful man, but he could never escape his past. In 2000, after serving more than 30 years, Reggie was released from prison on compassionate grounds. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and doctors said he did not have long to live. For the first time in decades, he stepped outside the prison walls as a free man. But freedom came too late. Just weeks later, Reggie Kray died at the age of 66. The deaths of Ronnie and Reggie marked the true end of the Kray twins. Their story, however, continued to live on. They had become part of London's history, names that people would never forget. To some, they were symbols of a glamorous but violent time, when crime and celebrity mixed in strange ways. To others, they were simply brutal men who destroyed lives and spread fear. In prison, the Krays had plenty of time to think about their lives. Whether they felt regret or pride will never be fully known. What is certain is that their choices left a mark on London forever. From the East End streets where they grew up to the high-class clubs they once ruled, their legacy was written in both charm and blood. The brothers had once believed they were untouchable. They thought their power, their reputation, and their bond as twins made them invincible. But in the end, time, justice, and fate caught up with them. Their empire vanished, their fame turned to infamy, and their final years were spent behind bars. Even so, the story of Ronnie and Reggie Kray continues to fascinate. Their names still appear in films, documentaries, and books. They remain part of the dark legend of London, a reminder of how two brothers rose to the top through fear and violence, and how they lost it all when the law finally closed in. The deaths of Ronnie and Reggie Kray closed the final chapter of their lives, but their story did not fade away. If anything, it became stronger. The Kray Twins became part of British history, figures remembered in both fascination and fear. Their names live on in books, films, and documentaries, and people still argue about who they really were, ruthless killers or misunderstood legends of the East End. In the East End of London, memories of the twins are mixed. Some older residents recall how Ronnie and Reggie would hand out money, buy drinks, or help families in need. To them, the Krays were not only gangsters but also protectors of their neighborhood. They believed the twins kept outsiders in line and showed pride in their roots. Stories of the Krays as local boys who looked after their own are still told, painting them as something more than criminals. But there is another side, darker and far less forgiving. For those who lived under their rule, the Krays brought only fear. Business owners who could not pay their demands lived in terror. Rivals were beaten, tortured, or killed. People were too afraid to speak out, even when they saw violence with their own eyes. To these victims, the Krays were not glamorous figures but monsters who ruined lives without mercy. This split in memory is part of what makes the Krays' story so powerful. They were both admired and hated, celebrated and condemned. Their ability to move between the world of crime and the world of celebrity made them unique. Few other criminals have ever been photographed with film stars one night and carried out a murder the next. It was this strange double life that continues to capture people's imagination. The legend of the Krays also grew because of the way they carried themselves. They dressed in perfect suits, spoke with confidence, and presented themselves as gentlemen. Reggie especially could charm anyone, while Ronnie's fierce presence made him unforgettable. Their bond as twins added to their image, two brothers identical in looks, united in loyalty, and feared across the city. Together, they seemed unstoppable, and that image has lasted long after their deaths. Over the years, films have been made about them, actors have played them, and books have retold their story. Each version adds to the myth, sometimes focusing on their violence, sometimes on their style, sometimes on their strange connection to fame. In popular culture, the Krays have become symbols of the darker side of the 1960s, a reminder that behind the music and fashion of that decade, crime and brutality also thrived. Yet historians and criminologists remind people not to be fooled by the myth. The Krays were not Robin Hood figures, and they were not heroes. They were gangsters who built their empire on fear. Their murders, their extortion, and their cruelty left scars that cannot be erased by stories of generosity. Behind the glamour was always violence. Behind the charm was always blood. The Krays' story also changed how the police handled organized crime. Their rise and fall showed how dangerous it was to let fear silence witnesses. After the twins were convicted, the police began developing stronger methods to fight gangs, and the public became more willing to speak out against criminals. In this way, the Krays left behind more than just their legend. They also shaped the way justice in Britain evolved. Even today, tourists visit the old pubs and streets of the East End where the Krays once walked. The Blind Beggar Pub, where George Cornell was murdered, has become a landmark in their story. Books and documentaries continue to explore their lives, often asking the same question: why do people still care so much about the Kray Twins? The answer lies in the mixture of fear and fascination they created. People are drawn to stories of power, crime, and downfall. The Krays had all of that. They rose from poor boys in the East End to kings of the London underworld. They tasted fame, power, and wealth, but in the end, they lost it all. Their story is one of ambition and destruction, loyalty and betrayal, glamour and horror. For Ronnie and Reggie, the bond between them was the one thing that never broke. They lived together, ruled together, and fell together. Even in prison, their loyalty to each other never wavered. To the end, they were twins bound by blood and crime. As time passes, the truth about the Krays becomes harder to separate from the legend. Some remember them as gentlemen, others as killers. In reality, they were both. Men who lived in two worlds and whose lives were filled with contradiction. Their story reminds us of the cost of power built on fear. For a time, the Krays looked unstoppable, but violence always brings consequences. Their rise was dramatic, their rule was brutal, and their fall was inevitable. London has changed since the days of the Krays. The streets they once ruled are no longer the same, and the underworld has moved on. But the memory of the twins lingers, their names etched into the city's history. Ronnie and Reggie Kray will forever be remembered as London's most notorious gangsters, symbols of both the glamour and the darkness of a time long gone. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends.